Hey there, Roland Fryer.
Hey, Glenn.
This is Glenn Loury at The Glenn Show at Blogging Heads and Brown University, and I have the great pleasure of talking with Roland Fryer, who's professor of economics at Harvard and director of the Education Innovation Laboratories, Ed Labs, at Harvard University. Welcome to The Glenn Show, Roland.
Thank you, Glenn. It's been a long time coming. Good to be on the show.
Yeah, man. So we're talking about education reform in the broadest terms here because this is an issue that you have been working on as long as I've known you, practically, Roland, 15 years darn near, and in which you've been engaged in some, really quite fascinating projects. I thought that our audience would benefit from hearing about the work that you've been doing and the conclusions that you have tentatively arrived at after this labor. Do you want to just begin by telling us a little bit about what you've been doing these last 10 plus years on? I mean, you don't have to tell us every detail.
I've been dying, man. trying to fix schools. That's what I've been doing slowly.
You bold enough to try to fix schools. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Or stupid enough.
Uh-huh.
At any rate, yeah. So, we have been working at this for a long time, and the kind of beginnings were you and I don't know if the audience knows this, but you and I discussing Neal and Johnson's famous 1996 JP paper, in which they argue that after accounting for test scores of lower teenagers, the racial gap in wages is substantially decreased. Hell, it even disappears in some specifications. And I remember hanging out at your institute and staying up all night trying to show that this paper was wrong. And then I just finally decided, okay, it was right, but what we're going to do about it. And the key insight there, right, Glenn, was that the question was, are people coming to the market with the same bundle of skills and the market is pricing those skills differently? That's discrimination. Or are people coming to the market with different sets of skills? And Neal and Johnson's conclusion was that a lot of racial inequality when it comes to wages is because people come to the market with less skills. And so therefore we should be thinking less about labor market policies to combat discrimination and more about how we get kids to the market with better skills. And that's really the launching point for these things. And, as befits an economist, my first idea was the incentives must be all wrong. And so we engaged in a 2-year, 4-city, $10 million experiment, paying kids for various activities. And I must admit, the blowback was something I didn't even anticipate. My own grandmother, who taught for 37 years, stopped talking to me for a year. It was just incredible, man. I mean, there were people telling me I was the worst thing for black people since the Tuskegee experiment. It's just unbelievable.
Let me slow you down. Let me just slow you down a minute, Roland.
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
because what you're doing right now is you're describing one step in a process of you're trying to address this overarching question, which is, are African Americans doing less well in the labor market because they're being mistreated, or are they doing less well because they have fewer skills?
Precisely.
You came to the conclusion reluctantly that the research was suggesting, at least now, if not 30 or 40 years ago, at least today, it was mainly less skills. And that
Yes.
drove you to looking at the institutions where people acquire the skills that they bring to the labor market, namely the schools. And in your first effort, you were engaged in experiments, I gather mainly in New York City, but 4 cities altogether, that tried to change the incentives that students had to acquire skills by offering them financial rewards if they would perform better or study harder in school. Am I describing this correctly?
Yeah, much more elegantly than I described it. Absolutely. That's exactly it.
And you were trying to make the point just when I interrupted you that you caught hell from a lot of quarters for even daring to ask that question. I want you to just say more about that.
Right. And it was a big surprise. I mean, I actually went into this naively thinking that we all thought that this was a problem and we should just, search for solutions wherever they may hide. I didn't realize you have to search for ones that are politically elegant as well. I didn't realize that. So we went after these incentives. And I remember sitting on a panel in New York, Lynn, and some woman was so angry at me for even attempting to pay kids incentives that She looked at me with like a face that was turning beet red, and she says, "What's next, Professor? You gonna pay kids not to bring guns to school?" And I thought, see, but don't ask for credit later. That's a good idea.
Oh, okay, but now I don't want you to get off track because we're talking about schools, but we're also talking about politics.
Mhm.
And one thing that occurs to me, a person might say, I want to know what your answer to it would be, is that it's so much better if kids do things for the intrinsic value of doing it and not for the financial reward.
Mhm.
Aren't we settling for less if we
Mhm.
bribe the kid not to bring a gun to school when we might have taught the kid that bringing a gun to school is just the wrong thing to do? Aren't we settling for less if we find a gimmick to get kids to read when what we really want is for kids to love reading?
Okay, I like everything you said except for the gimmick, in the sense that you put that in there. But yes, and I also think countries should cut their emissions because it's the right thing to do, Glenn. And shall I? I mean, you said we're only going to talk for 45 minutes. I got a long list of stuff that we should do because it's the right thing.
Yeah,
Okay,
you and
and
I
here's
should
my
go.
thing. Here's
Yeah, go
my
ahead.
thing. If you This problem is hard enough, right? We're talking about the acquisition of skills for the most vulnerable populations in America and hell across the world. This problem is hard enough. I can't be constrained at the outset for what I can look at, right? You don't tell a brain surgeon, yeah, well, put your right hand behind your back and then try it. So my view was, let's try a bunch of things. If 5 of them work and kind of have the similar or the same return on investment, then let's pick one of those that we think is more politically palatable. But hell, we don't have anything. So how can you be upset with just trying? That was my
Yeah,
view.
yeah. Well, what happened there in those four cities where you were paying kids to learn and trying to figure out if incentives were the key?
Okay, so in half of the cities, Glenn, we paid for behaviors. So in places like Dallas, we paid kids to read books, and in uh, Washington D.C., we paid them to come to school and to do their homework and things like that. In the other two cities, we paid for output. We said if you get high test scores, we give you money. Or in Chicago, we said if you get good grades, we give you money. And quite different from what economic theory would predict, paying for the behaviors turned out to be quite effective. But paying for the output gave us pure zeros when we looked at the actual evaluation of the programs. So what we found is that kids will kind of do what you need them to do, and do what you ask them to do. And if you tie incentives to behaviors, but if you tie it to output, which we do in a lot of corporate settings, et cetera, they don't know the steps to get the output, even if they're excited to do it. So I think that our general view was people will pay for it, but the hope that kids would get excited about schools and that this would have spillovers to other activities just didn't happen. And so we ran this experiment. I think we learned a lot, and we moved on from there. We didn't keep trying to beat that horse. We just decided, yeah, some incentive programs can work, but they're really not going to take a big slice out of the problem.
The generalization here is that if I want to get kids in attendance improved, if I want to get them to complete homework assignments, if I want to get them to read, I don't know, 3 books over the summer, or maybe it's only 1 book, I can achieve that with financial incentives, at least based on your experiments.
Yes.
But if I'm trying to get kids to increase their reading or their mathematics proficiency, then because these kids, we're imagining, don't fully understand how to do that, rewarding them for doing it doesn't really lead to them doing any better because they don't know how to translate their behavior into a better outcome. Am I getting this right?
It's very close to right. You ask a kid in Chicago. So I said, we gave you incentives. Why didn't you get better test scores? He said, I was excited. Came to school the next day. It was still hard. Right? And then I said, well, did you think about taking the money and buying yourself a tutor and kind of borrowing from your expected income? Or did
No,
you,
you
well,
didn't.
no, why are you laughing? That's the economic theory. That's what it would say.
Yeah, but that's not what you said to the kid.
Not exactly, but kind of something like that,
All
right? I
right, all
did,
right.
you know what I mean? So, and I also said, or did you think about staying later? Or did you raise your hand more in class so that you could make sure that you were following along? And he looked at me as if I'd stole something. He said, no, I never thought of any of that, right? So, and our economic theory assumes that all those things are right at their disposal. It's just a matter of having the right incentives. And so I think we learned a lot in the qualitative work that we did, interviewing kids, et cetera, after the experiment about what the incentives did. The only thing that I would correct about your summary, Glenn, was that
Yes.
when we did pay kids to read books, they did read the books, and their reading comprehension scores actually went up, right? But if you pay them directly for the reading comprehension scores, they don't read books. You
I
see what I'm
see.
saying?
No, I do see what you're saying,
Yeah.
and I find it to be interesting, and I also find to be interesting, although this is a bit off of our point, the general observation one is making about the limits of the assumptions that we take for granted when we do economic theory, insofar as they apply to the behaviors, at least of certain people.
Right.
Maybe kids from low income neighborhoods who are going to public schools don't do a expected present value of lifetime income maximization program before they decide whether or not to open the book.
That's right. That's right.
But
That's right.
a lot of what we just take as for granted about how economic policies will work and how behavior will be affected by those policies presumes that people do that kind of thing, or at least act as if they do. And so here's an example where that assumption is not borne out in carefully evaluated empirical data.
What I
So
find lovely about that is that we're talking about second graders in Dallas, right? So to solve the actual optimal effort problem, they need to know, some analysis and college calculus. But the problem they're trying to solve is about whether or not they should learn their fractions or not. So it's stretching the theory a little much.
yeah, although the old argument for Milton Friedman and others was that if my theory is that the leaves on a tree will be heaviest on the side that faces the sun, I don't need for the tree to do the calculation about maximizing the
Understood.
amount of hemoglobin or amount of whatever. I don't know enough about biology to be able to state
No,
this
but I
clearly, but you
understand what
understand
you.
what I'm saying. And
Yeah.
likewise, I don't need the kids to actually solve the problem. I just need for the behavior to somehow gravitate in the direction as if it were solving the problem. But your point is, it doesn't do that.
Yeah, or you need the parents to help solve the problem, right? The parents to know better and to have a sense of a heuristic to solve the problem. And that's the case in which inner cities kids versus suburban kids may be very different, right?
Yeah, that's right. Now, while you were doing this work on experimenting with whether financial incentives could work, a lot of it was being done in New York City
Yes,
when Michael Bloomberg was mayor and Joel Klein was superintendent of schools there.
yes.
What was that like and where there must have been intense scrutiny from the press and
Yeah.
from the local, people interested in education and so forth. What was it like to try to be a green eye shade wearing Harvard academic solving, quote unquote, the problems of education with the unions looking over your shoulder, the city council spouting off to the newspaper, and et cetera, et cetera? To the extent that you can share that with us.
It was. I'll tell you what I told my grandmother. I said, "This is the most I've learned since you taught me how to read." It was an eye-opening experience. It taught me that politics and government are probably not for me.
Huh.
It taught me that I saw one of your previous interviews with scarcity with Eldar, and you talk
Hmm.
about scarcity. Uh, I walked into the Department of Ed every day and said, today is the day I'm going to think really hard about, you know, XYZ problem in the schools. And then you go in at 8 a.m., you take incoming missiles until 7 p.m. because there's, with 1,000 schools and 1 million kids, there's always something. And then you go home at 8 p.m. and you say, tomorrow I'm really going to think about that. And that happened every day for 7 months. It was an incredible experience. The most difficult part, I have to say, for me was the press scrutiny. And partly because it wasn't like we were out trying to garner it. And you know how academic works. People were saying, well, why are you always in the newspapers? I was thinking, I'd love not to be. When you do development economics, and I'm not trying to say anything about those experiments, but
Right.
you can put tolls on you can analyze a toll road or build roads in Mogadishu, and New York Times is not going to bother you. But you try to do that in Harlem and see what happens. And so we had press in our schools, Glenn, on day 4 of the experiment, trying to see if it worked. And,
Right.
I said to one of the reporters, I said, man, it's day 4. I said, Jeff Canada, and I know Jeff well now. I didn't know him then. I said, he's
Hmm.
been running schools for years, and people aren't bothering him about whether or not it's working. And they basically said, we like him. We don't like you. I said, okay. So I
For
think
our audience,
these incentives really hit a nerve, and the level of scrutiny was incredible.
I just wanted to say Jeffrey Canada is the leader of the Harlem Children's Zone
Right.
movement in New York City, which runs charter schools amongst other things,
Right.
and is very well liked by the cognoscenti around town as doing the Lord's work with low income and minority
Right.
people.
Right.
But
Right.
whereas you and Jeffrey are laboring in the same vineyard, they liked him and they didn't like you.
Yeah, obviously, and Jeff's an American hero. I love Jeff too. At that point, I was just trying to make the point that hey, it's day 4, right? And they wrote
Yeah,
an article, day 4. Attendance is not up. No results on test scores because they haven't taken a test. It's day 4, so that was the
yeah,
most difficult part for me. And when you and I have done our collaborations, Glenn, we don't have the New York Times sitting behind us if we make mistakes in our theory, if we take the derivative wrong, which we never do, but if we
right.
did, no one's sitting behind going, oh, look at that, look at that, look at that, and then attributing bias or potential worry if the derivative is wrong. Oh, look, he's
Right.
trying to push the results in that direction. It's
Yeah.
just an intense environment, and it's added years on my life, my man.
Added years or taken off?
There you go, taking off. See, it's even screwed my addition and subtraction.
Okay, so that was an interesting learning experience, both about politics and about social behavior. We might want to get better educational outcomes, but if we're dealing with disadvantaged population of kids, we better not think that we can do it by just bribing them. So where do you go from there in this odyssey of trying to understand the foundations of reforming institutions of public education in the United States?
Oh, it was ironic. So at the same time we were doing the evaluation of the incentives work, I was also doing the evaluation of the Harlem Children's Zone. And um, in the best case scenario for incentives, you'd get a treatment effect of, 0.16 standard deviations, let's call it. And has a high return on investment because that's because it's cheap. But the racial gap to be solved is 1 standard deviation. Okay, so you've cut it down a bit, but not very much. At the same time, I was doing Jeff Canada's evaluation of the Harlem Children's Zone, Glenn, and realized that in 3 years, kids who entered his schools in 6th grade, by the time they were exiting 8th graders, had actually caught up to the New York City average white student. It was unbelievable.
In 2 years?
In 3 years.
Three
So
years?
they enter
Oh,
sixth
sixth,
grade, they
seventh,
leave.
eighth grade. Okay.
Absolutely. And in math, they had caught up with no controls. I'm not talking about they caught up if they were also in good housing. No, no, no. Just the kids who went to the Harlem Children's Zone and were admitted by random lottery on April 14, 2005. Those kids, by the time they exited 8th grade, had caught up in math to the average white student in New York City. And in reading, they had cut the gap in a third. So
Wow.
on the one hand, and this is where social science gets really interesting because you got to decide as a researcher what you want to do. On the one hand, my incentives work was garnering lots of attention, most unwanted and and a lot negative, and people really excited about that work. But I knew it wasn't going to actually get us there. Right? It could get us a high return on investment, but if your goal was to solve a problem, if to actually to um, get low income Black and Hispanic kids to compete with average white kids in places like New York City or Houston or where have you, incentives were not going to get you there. And
Yeah.
then you see a guy like Jeff Canada, and whatever he's doing, he's 70% of the way there. Right. And so I
Yeah.
had this dinner with my wife, man, and I said to her, we were sitting I'll never forget, we're at Gran Gusto, his pizza place in Cambridge on Garden Street, sorry, Sherman Street. And I said, you know, no one's going to, there's no academic acclaim for a guy like me trying to figure out what Jeff Canada has done. Right. I don't know. I don't want to disappoint my thesis advisors and stuff if all I do is try to figure out what this guy has done. On the other hand, I can keep running my own experiments. And she said to me, look, you know, maybe you need to change from economist to engineer. Maybe you need to think about what he's doing well, what can be packaged into pill form and put into traditional public schools. And that's what I've been working on for the last 4 years. And what I noticed is that when you talk to people like Jeff Canada or the other leaders of terrific schools, charter or public, doesn't matter. One of the best elementary schools I've ever been into was a regular traditional public school in Fairfield Elementary School, where 99% of the kids are on free lunch, but 99% of the kids are passing the state test every year. You realize they're kind of like, our grandmothers, Glenn, and who can cook up a storm, but can't really tell you what's in the dish. Right? So
Yes.
that's what Jeff would do. I mean, if you talk to my grandma and say, oh, this cake tastes wonderful, what do you have in it? She'd say, a pinch of this, a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And then you can try to make it. It's not going to work. It won't taste like hers. Right. And so
Not the
that's
first time. Not the first time.
not the first time. Right. And so what we
Right.
did was we spent a year hanging out in all sorts of schools, great schools, bad schools, and collecting tons of data by video, by interviewing principals and teachers and interviewing kids and trying to understand what predicted why some schools with the same seeming inputs and kids did drastically better than others. Okay, and so here's a more crystal clear, right, a more clear snapshot of what we did. Went to New York, took 50 charter schools. The average of those charter schools is roughly zero. Okay, in terms of they're not any better than the traditional public schools, but
Okay.
there are schools on the right tail of that distribution, Glenn, that knocking it out of the park. Harlem
Yeah.
Children's Zone, Democracy Prep, Success Academy. There's a bunch of them. However, there's some on the left tail of that distribution who are terrible. Okay.
So what makes them different? What differentiates
Exactly.
them?
Right. And so we found that 5 things explain 50% of the variance of what made some schools better than others. And those things are more time in school, higher quality teachers, so how you select and retain and develop your teachers. Third, kind of student differentiation. The schools that were effective tutored kids in very small groups for 100, 150 hours a year. The fourth was how you use data to actually drive instruction. So if you think of schooling in America, my favorite analogy is, could you imagine playing basketball where for 6 months you shot shots and they just went behind this black curtain and you had no idea if they went in or not. And then in 6 months, someone comes back and says, hey, Glenn, you won by 7 points. How are you going to get any better? You have no idea how to update. And the last one really was they had a culture of high expectations. And those 5 things explain 50% of the variance, as I said before. And what's kind of remarkable about them is 2 things. One is that things like per pupil expenditure and kind of the classic things that we've looked at in terms of school inputs weren't very predictive in this charter sample. And the second is that they're so damn obvious. Okay. When I remember talking to my grandmother at one point, and she said, well, what are you doing up there at Harvard? And I said, well, I'm trying to understand why some schools are good and some schools are not so good with similar kids. And she said, well, what are they? I was an educator. And so I told her my 5 things, like I just told you.
Mm-hmm.
And she told me, and I quote, they pay you for that shit.
In other words, we knew this all along.
Of course, right? And everyone I talk to, yeah, maybe they'll add a 6th or 7th one, but these are kind of basic principles, best practices, if you will. And to my amazement, we weren't doing them systematically in large urban school districts. And so we kind of, after trying to discover what the kind of 5 best practices were, we, through a very circuitous route, which I won't get into today, we actually stumbled on Houston, Texas, where they implemented these 5 things in their lowest performing 20 schools, and they did it for 3 years, and that just finished. And to our, I don't know if delight is the right word, amazement, what have you, the scores after 3 years look remarkably similar to the Harlem Children's Zones of the world and the other successful charters.
Okay, let me stop you for a minute. Yeah.
Last thing, and it's with the school board, it's with collective bargaining agreements, it's with all the stuff that folks have been saying you can't do real reform with these constraints.
Okay, in. I want to hear a lot more about what happens in Houston, and I just want
Sure.
to kind of review the bidding because the story is getting complicated, although very interesting. Okay, so we start out in New York City. We think we can incentivize with financial incentives. We run an experiment not only in New York and four other cities. We learn what we learned that you've described in detail. There is a positive effect, but it's small. Even in the best case, you say like 1/6 of a standard deviation improvement from
Yeah.
the in the best case from the
Right.
financial incentive
Right.
when we're starting with a 1.0, a full standard deviation difference on average between
Right.
test score performance of black and white youngsters. Now that's a big difference. What a standard deviation takes us from the 50th to the 85th percentile of a population,
Right.
something like that.
Right.
So that's a huge difference, of which maybe 1/6 of that difference at most could be closed with the financial incentives. That would be an economically high return investment because it's cheap to do, but it would not solve the problem. You walk across the street and you find Jeffrey Canada's practice in the Harlem Children's Zone, which, when you look at carefully, shows you that, my God, somehow in 3 years, he's managing for the people that he's dealing with in this disadvantaged population to close that full standard deviation gap through whatever it is that he's doing in there.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now, it's not clear what he's doing in there, and he can't tell you what he's doing in there, but you've got a lot of different charter school experiments going on around New York City. They don't all perform equally well. You can study them and catalog what seems to be associated with the ones that do better, like Canada's, than the ones that do worse. And you come
Right.
out with these things: school day longer, higher quality teachers,
Right.
tutoring for the students, high expectations, and use feedback data in order to learn from what works and what doesn't work in your own situation. And now you're going to take what you've learned and see whether or not in the public schools in Houston that somehow you and your collaborators are able to get access to and implement this experiment, about which I want to hear more. Whether or not in fact, by taking these nostrums about what makes for a good school and applying them systematically, you can actually get a beneficial result. And it looks like that's what you're finding happens in Houston.
Right. And the reason I want to just put this out there because I think this is important. The reason that I decided, and again, to be very personal here, I decided that 1/6 wasn't enough is because those are our kids in those schools, man. You know, I have a 10-month-old daughter. If she's a gap behind and I can find something, a Band-Aid that gets her 1/6 of the way, I don't stop, right? It's a
Right.
decision we've got to make as a country. I don't stop. Right? I want to solve a problem. And that's where we went into the business of basically trying to figure out school productivity, if you will. That's how we would say it in economics terms. Why are there productivity differences between these seemingly comparable institutions?
These are our kids, and not only because they may, many of them, be kids of color.
That's right.
These are our kids because here we are in the United States of America, supposed to be the land of opportunity and of equality of opportunity.
That's right.
And we are systematically failing some of our least advantaged kids in this country, many of whom, but not all of whom, are children of color.
That's right. So, if we're willing to settle with 1/6 standard deviation, then we have low expectations. So we're not meeting all the 5 tenets.
So tell us, I'm really fascinated to know how it is that in a big city, Houston, with a teachers union and with the politics of a school board and with all of that, you manage to be able to implement an experiment where you actually change the composition of teachers, the principals who are leading the schools. I mean, you haven't said so, but I'm sure this is entailed in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to tell us both what you did and how you were able to do it, as well as what results you were able to find.
Sure. I think two reasons. One, Superintendent in Houston, Terry Greer, is a phenomenal, phenomenal human being, an American hero in my eyes. And he was willing to do this, but Houston was not first on my radar, right? We tried a bunch of other school districts and they all said, basically, are you crazy? And he was willing to do it. He really cared. And the second thing, Lynn, is what I learned from New York. We talked about I went to school there in the sense of the political realities and how you work with on the ground troops to try to do reform. So what we did was, it won't sound like much to you, but I think I must have stayed a little over 20 days in a row in Houston, going and talking with the superintendent and all of the different political constituency groups. We went in people's living rooms and, with state Congress people and with, the board, and just did the basic political blocking and tackling to be able to do this. And the folks in Houston wanted wanted something different. Adding to this mix is the fact that 9 of the 20 schools were going to be taken over by the state potentially. And
Ah,
the superintendent, right, asked a bunch of the charter folks if they wanted these schools. I also wasn't his first choice. So, and they said, "Oh, if you're willing to uh, close the schools and open them up one grade level at a time, we'll do it." Right? And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to keep the legacy of some of these schools that had rich alumni 30 years ago. You know, rich meaning culturally rich, et
yeah.
cetera, alumni 30 years ago. And so together we devised a plan. Here was the plan. In the 20 schools, 19 out of the 20 principals were removed.
Removed,
Removed.
reassigned,
No.
fired.
You know, I think, yes, of course. I mean, I think the nicer way to say it is that, you know, we freed up their future. Yes,
Wow.
look, if the way the federal government stuff works on this now, if you're a chronically low performing school and you want to apply for government funds to do turnaround
Yeah,
of those schools, and the principal's been there more than 2 years, the principal has to be removed.
I see.
Okay, so this is very consistent with what the current administration is doing. Um, Roughly 50% of the teachers were removed. We lengthened the school day an hour. We lengthened the school year 2 weeks. That amounts to roughly 30 more days of school for these kids.
Wow.
In the extra hour, we hired 400 tutors to come in and tutor kids 2-on-1, 2 kids, 1 tutor. We did this. I would have loved to have done it in every grade level, in every subject. Couldn't afford that. It was already a very expensive experiment when you start lengthening school days and years. So we did it in kind of critical growth years, if you will, 4th grade, 6th grade, and 9th grade. We tutored in math. Folks said, "Oh, there's no way you're going to get tutors in Houston, people in Houston to tutor for $20,000 a year." We had 1,200 applications in 5 weeks.
Where did they come from? Who were they? The college kids?
They came from 2 big buckets of folks: retirees in Houston who had worked in places like, you know, at NASA and other kind of engineering places
Wow.
around Houston. And second was the college kids, kind of Teach for America types who wanna, you know, we ran a campaign, Give a Year, Change a Life. And we got a bunch of kids who were on their way to Stanford or law or wherever,
Yeah.
and stopped by and did tutoring for a year. And
Wow.
so it was just terrific. I think that was one of the coolest parts of the program, is to
This
walk
is
into a class, Glenn, and see 2 kids at a half moon shaped table and a tutor. Uh, and all our tutors had college degrees, and watch them really work through Algebra 1 in 9th grade, and work through numeracy in 4th grade. It was really a terrific thing to see. And then we implemented data systems so that we could collect, track, analyze data on student performance on a regular kind of 4-week cycle. So teaching units, right? Again, this is so simple. I'm embarrassed to tell you this. You know, you were one of my thesis advisors. 4-week units, you test in that 4 weeks, you go back, you build intervention days into the school year, right? So that you can go back and reteach the things that you didn't get. It's just pretty simple. And in terms of culture of high expectations, we had a view that we understood that every kid, college was not for everybody. I understand that. You know, you and I understand supply and demand like nobody's business. But we weren't going to make the decisions for them. So in the 3 years of the experiment, every single one of our kids was accepted into a 2 or 4 year college. Every single one, 100%.
wow, Roland. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's not really amazing. Turns out if you lock them in the gym and don't let them out until they apply, it works. And you know why I say that, Glenn? Because again, I'm gonna go back to our kids versus those kids. If they're your kids, right?
Yeah.
What would you do? You're gonna apply. No, I'm not. Then you're not going outside till you apply.
You would credibly project the high expectations that you have for your kid, that they're going to make something with their God-given talents and their
That's
enormous
exactly
opportunity.
right.
And why
Exactly
should we
right.
do any less for these kids who come out of a housing project or from
That's
a
all I'm
single
saying.
parent or whatever?
You would do in my household for my 10-month-old. It's already the default option, right? It's the default option. So we wanted to make it the default option. You don't have to go, but you're in if you do want to.
Okay, now this is 20 schools. Are these all elementary, or there's some secondary school, high schools in there as well?
11 elementary, 5 middle schools, and 4 high schools.
I
Um,
see.
Yeah. And
And not,
we also did this in Denver. We have 7 schools in Denver where we've done it, and it's starting to spread now that the experiment is over. But kind of the original big city was Houston.
Now you
Was
say
one school.
experiment, and that implies a control group. So this
Sure.
is being compared to other schools which are unaffected by your intervention.
Yes, so that's more complicated. Let me try to explain it. For the first 9 schools, which were the secondary schools, the 5 middles and the 4 high schools, um, they were chronically low performing. So, I tried. I did my best. I put my best Cambridge empirical hat on when I first met with the superintendent and said, we have to randomize. And he says, the state's going to take him over. I'm not doing that. Then Roland Fryer, the person who grew up in schools like this, took over and said, yeah, we're not going to randomize. But for the elementary schools, they were not on the verge of being taken over. So what we did was we took the kind of lowest performing 22 elementary schools for shorthand in Houston, and we randomly assigned 11 to be treated. And so we have a real control group for the
I
elementary
see.
schools.
I see.
For the secondary schools, we have to use comparison samples, and you can read through the paper. We use all of HISD. We use large cities in Texas. We use what the Texas Education Agency says should be comparison schools, and the results all look similar. So we're um, uh,
Okay.
so maybe
So yeah, with the secondary schools, you don't have a natural experiment or
yeah,
any kind of
a real
randomization.
exactly.
You
But for the
tried it,
elementary schools, we do.
but for the element and for the middle schools, no, they were just ethically not acceptable
Yeah,
that you would not treat them.
right.
Yeah. So what are you finding?
We're finding that the per year gain um, in elementary school per year is 0.27 standard deviation. So that's a little more. That's a little more than 3 months of school. That's larger than the effect sizes of the Harlem Children's Zone elementary schools, but it's right consistent with many of the most successful charters. So that basically says, the kids will be caught up in 2.5 years. Okay, or three
Wow.
years. And for the secondary schools, we're getting about 0.15 per year. So that means that over the 3 years, it's roughly uh, half a standard deviation. So it's going to take 6 years to close that gap. Here's what's even kind of more interesting to me, Glenn. In the grade levels, fourth, sixth, and ninth, where we actually implemented all 5 tenets because we could afford it, those gains are much larger. So the elementary school gains are greater than zero point 0.3 standard deviations. And check this out, secondary gains, almost half a standard deviation a year. The kids got tutored.
It's too big to
Uh,
be true.
yeah, that's what they say. Sydney's empirical seminars. That's too small. That's too big. That looks right. Yeah, I agree. It's a large effect. It's a very large effect, man, and it's based on these very, very simple principles. The question is about execution at this point.
So let me see if I got this. You're now in a position to claim on the basis of a multi-year and expansive, just such as you've described, social experiment, that we actually know how to solve the schools failing problem, the problem of underperforming schools for low income and minority kids. We know the solution. You've documented the solution, and now it's up to the world to simply embrace that truth and to move in that direction. Am I understanding you? You think you've got this problem solved?
I would say it's 60% of that in the sense that I think for math we know these are I've been quoting your math results, and just like the Harlem Children's Zone and KIP and the others, our reading results are not quite there.
Okay.
Um,
So
and so
reading is a tougher nut than math. It would
yes, it
appear.
is. Reading's a tougher nut than math. I would say we probably decreased the reading gap by I don't know somewhere between 20% and a third, just like the Harlem Children's Zone. But so yeah, other than that, yes, and it cost okay $1,837 more per kid. And here's the crazy part, man. This when we first got started, people say you're never going to turn around these poor performing schools. They have a culture of failure, right? I sat at breakfast with a previous Secretary of Education of our country, and jokingly before our breakfast, he said, "Let's just say a prayer for you." It's just not going to happen. And now that the results are what they are, the pushback I'm getting is, yes, they did work, but you spent more money.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I mean, I think we need to understand $1,800 per kid is what? Less than 10% of the average that's being spent per kid at a big city school system?
Um, no, it's more than that. I would say
Okay.
that it's they're spending roughly 14 grand a kid or something like that.
Okay, so it's 8% or something like that.
Yeah. And but it's look, we can do a return on investment. We know that test scores are correlated with income and graduation and other things later. That we have reasonable estimates of how important that is. And my estimate is the return on investment is roughly 15%. Okay. The historical returns of the stock market from 1950 until 2011 were 5%. You do the math.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misspoke. If it's 1,800 a year and the average is 14,000, then that's going to be more like I don't know what 12 or
Yeah,
13%.
it's greater than 10%. That's for sure.
But in any case, the rate of return on such investment, that is the measured economic benefit associated with increasing students' performance from spending the additional 2 grand a year,
Yes,
is very high, higher than what you can historically get on by investing your money in the U.S. stock market or other
that's right.
comparable rates of return.
Here's what's more. In the elementary schools, we spent no more. We took the Title I money that comes with low income kids from the federal government, and we repurposed the Title I money and spent it for the tutors. This can be done, Glenn.
Yeah.
It can be
Okay,
done.
now every principal except one is out.
Hmm.
Half the teachers are gone. That can't be done.
Yeah, well, then, oh, it can be. Oh, it can be.
Or
It's
perhaps I
not
should
being
say,
done.
it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, but
Yeah,
that's part of what would have to
yeah,
take place
yeah.
to reform
And
institutions, in your
yeah,
view.
and so the next thing we're doing is trying to understand how much of what we found in Houston is due to basic management principles. Okay, so we are thinking through another experiment that would start fall 2014 that would leave the human capital intact and basically try to manage the schools better with the data and tutoring, et cetera, like that, and run it at zero marginal cost. I would have thought naively, again, every time I think I understand education reform, I'm keenly aware of how naive I am. I would have thought, hey, once you have results like this, people will accept them. I mean, if this were business and you had a good idea, you'd have to patent the damn thing because everyone would steal it. You can't give away a good education reform. And so part of the pushback we're getting is it's too expensive, and the things you're describing, the human capital turnover is too much. So we're going to try that and see if you can make progress without those things. But if you can't, it still means that something can be done. And for me, this is a proof of concept, if you will. And, we know it can be done in regular old public schools, Glenn. Now, notice we didn't talk about the parents at all.
No, you didn't.
Okay, we have none of these kids signed up for a lottery. They didn't have to. These are neighborhood schools.
Are the parents a part of any of this intervention that you're talking about? Is it all
Many of
happening at the
the
school?
all happening at the school. Many of the principals, and probably all the principals, have tons and tons of parent outreach. But
Yeah.
the issue is, I don't want folks using it as an excuse not to educate them. I hear it all the time. What can we do? They're parents. I mean, parents need to read to them more, and then we can do, right? But
Well,
kids don't ask what parents they get. So how are we going to hold them accountable for the parents they got?
you can't, but maybe you can induce the parents to behave differently. But it sounds like you're finding that that's not where the leverage should be placed.
Maybe it should be. Maybe we should run experiments on that. I've never thought of how to get adequate leverage there. All I've ever heard it be used as an excuse. And I tell folks over and over again, the parents can sending you the best kids they got. They're not hiding the good ones at home. So we're going to have to just take these kids and educate these kids, right?
But
And
but
if
you
the
got
parents are, go ahead.
no.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say you got 400 tutors. You got 2-on-1 students on tutor, and it's making a difference.
Right.
But is that a substitute for parental involvement, or if parents are paying more attention to their kids' homework, or are tutors and parents complements or substitutes? Is what I'm asking.
I hope they're compliments. I don't know the answer to that question. I really don't know. All I can confidently say is if you do these 5 things, you get these results. That's what we
Yep.
did. I've heard stories both ways in terms of anecdotes, and I just don't know.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to have to close, but let me just ask you this because this is all very political. There are people out there. I think of Michelle Rhee as one of them. I'm not asking you to evaluate people, but I'm asking you to talk about the general tenor of the debate in the country about educational reform. I'm reading Diane Ravitch ranting in the New York Review of Books and elsewhere about all the stuff that you're trying to do with, puts too much burden on schools and they can't be expected to solve this problem and so forth and so on. Charter schools are controversial in many jurisdictions, and you just embrace the charter school model for how to solve our education problems. So, how do you read the politics of the school reform movement at this stage, and where does your initiative fit into this larger conversation that is getting very crowded nowadays?
I don't know. Don't think I would say I embrace the charter model. I would say I think that they have best practices that seem to be general lessons about how to increase productivity,
Okay,
and those that's a slightly different angle. Glenn.
duly noted.
The politics of this to me are incredibly frustrating. I'm not a, or at least I'm not a public intellectual type guy who talks about politics a lot. I'm a guy who's out there with his sleeves rolled up, trying to actually just figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I hang my hat. I guess what I would say is a lot less talking and a lot more doing would help a lot. I just don't. I mean, it seems like people are just talking past each other, and it feels like we're fighting the wrong battles. It's like schools versus this versus that. Who's to blame? It feels like we're fighting the wrong battles, in my view. And the more we talk, I've been doing this now for 5 years, right? So, or more than that, but this particular experiment,
Hmm.
and we've done that, and there have been 5 cohorts of fourth graders who have lost that year while folks are still talking.
I hear you.
So my view is, here we have something. I think it's not perfect. It's not all the way there, but it certainly has a lot of promise, and we ought to be figuring out how we can come together to work on that. Right? It's not about blame. Blame's not going to get us anywhere, and that's what I feel like the politics is about. It's about fighting the wrong battles, and about figuring out who's to blame for the situation we're in, rather than rolling our sleeves up and working together to figure this thing out.
This is Roland Gerhard Fryer of Harvard University, and I'm so glad that you gave us some of your time, Roland. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Glenn. Really appreciate you having me on.
Okay, bye bye.